Have you ever felt abandoned by your own family? I used to think it was just a fleeting feeling until I was completely forgotten during one of the most important events in my parents' lives, their wedding. The day they were happy with everyone, while I was left out. But perhaps the worst part wasn't being forgotten, but how I reacted and everything that happened afterward. When I found out that my parents decided to get married, I couldn't hide my joy. They had been together for so many years but had never officially married, and when my father proposed to my mother on the anniversary of when they first met, it felt like a miracle to all of us. From that moment, everyone started planning a small wedding with just close family and friends attending in Hawaii. As they began organizing the wedding, I felt excited, thinking that finally, I would have a role in the family's special day. But as things progressed, I quickly realized that once again, I was being left out. My mother immediately asked my sister to be the maid of honor, and my father asked my brother to be the best man. I wasn't surprised or hurt by this because I was used to my sister and brother always being the ones closest to my parents. My sister and mother always shared common interests, frequently going shopping and spending time together, while my brother and father bonded over sports and working on cars. I, on the other hand, always felt like the odd one out in the family. I tried to join in on family activities, making an effort to connect, but all of my attempts were in vain. Even though I desperately wanted to be closer to my family, it seemed like my parents and siblings weren't interested. They had their own world, and I was just a stranger in my own home. I began to feel isolated and slowly accepted that maybe I would always be the outsider in this family. As the wedding day grew closer, I noticed that I was completely excluded from the preparations. My mother didn't invite me to go dress shopping, and every meeting about the wedding took place without me. I stayed quiet, hoping that eventually my parents would realize my absence and ask for my input on the wedding. But nothing changed. They carried on with their plans, never once mentioning me. Although I didn't want to cause trouble or add any more stress, I thought that surely they would notice my absence and ask me about the preparations. But I was wrong. The day before the trip to Hawaii, my mother casually asked if I had packed yet, as we couldn't be late for the airport. I bluntly told her that I hadn't packed anything. She seemed confused at first, then snapped at me for not being prepared. That's when I asked her if I even had a plane ticket, and her face went pale. I realized that they hadn't bought me a ticket. Not only that, but I also wasn't sure if I even had a room in Hawaii. Meanwhile, they had bought first-class tickets for my siblings and their friends, but completely forgot about me. When my mother told me not to make a big deal out of it, saying they could just get me a cheap last-minute ticket, I responded, "Then what? What will I wear to the ceremony?" She and my sister had bought their dresses months ago, but I was left out. My father then came in and told me to just accept it, because I wasn't the type to be into girly things. I was furious, not because I couldn't wear a fancy dress, but because I was excluded from every part of this important event in my parents' lives. They called me selfish and accused me of intentionally playing the victim so they would forget me, but I couldn't stand the feeling of being left out once again. When my father told me to just stay home if I couldn't accept it, I retorted, "Fine, I'll stay." And the next morning, my whole family left for Hawaii without me. Since I was little, I always felt like the outsider in my family. Even though we lived under the same roof, I was always the one left out, not belonging to any of my parents' or siblings' worlds. My sister and mother shared a special bond, shopping together, talking, and sharing intimate moments that I couldn't be a part of. My brother and father were the same. They spent time together playing sports and working on cars, and I would just stand by, feeling like an outsider. Every time I tried to join in on family activities, I couldn't fit in. No matter how good my intentions were, I was always gently rejected. Slowly, I began to realize that I didn't belong in this family. My parents always gave special attention to my siblings, while I was always forgotten. My efforts to connect with them were in vain, and I started feeling more and more isolated in my own home. This sense of isolation wasn't just a fleeting feeling. It became a permanent part of my life. I didn't have the late-night talks with my parents like my sister had, Nor did I have the sports or car conversations with my brother like they did. Every meal felt like I was a ghost sitting at the table, watching my family bond while I couldn't find a place for myself within it. Even during holidays or special occasions, when the family gathered together, I always felt like I was on the outside looking in. That feeling of being left out became inseparable from my daily existence. Each time I saw my sister and mother chatting away or my brother and father bonding over something, I felt more and more like I didn't fit. Despite trying to change, to find a way to connect, it always felt like those invisible barriers were too strong to break. With my parents' wedding, I hoped that things would be different. I thought I would finally have a part to play, even if it was just a small one in the grand event of the family. But instead of feeling loved and included, I found myself once again being left out. When my mother didn't invite me to go dress shopping or when my father didn't involve me in any of the plans for the trip, I felt even more like an outsider. Their actions, though unspoken, made it clear that I didn't matter to them. As the wedding day drew closer, I decided to stay quiet, hoping that my parents would notice my absence and ask why I wasn't a part of the plans. But nothing ever happened. No one asked about me. No one cared that I wasn't involved. They continued preparing for the wedding as if I didn't exist. That feeling of being forgotten had been building up inside me for years, and now it was a pain I could no longer bear. All my attempts to be loved and cared for had been in vain. My entire family seemed to have an invisible wall separating me from them, and I was just the person standing outside, looking into a world I could never be a part of. With all the pent-up feelings over the years, as my parents' wedding approached, I braced myself for more of the same neglect, but I never imagined it would get this bad. The way my parents ignored me during the wedding preparations made me feel like a ghost in my own home. Everyone around me was excited, discussing the tiniest details of the wedding, while I could only watch, filled with questions and hurt. They might not have noticed, but I saw every small sign, every event I wasn't included in. During the preparations, I thought maybe I would get some attention, even if it was just being invited to try on wedding dresses or help with the planning. But instead of being invited to join any activities, I found myself being pushed further away. My mother would go dress shopping with my sister, and my father would discuss wedding plans with my brother. But I wasn't part of any of it. Every time I tried to ask a question or offer my thoughts on the wedding, I was met with a cold shoulder or a dismissive look. Slowly, I realized that my exclusion wasn't some accidental oversight. It was a deliberate choice by my parents, a neglect that I could no longer deny. I started questioning myself. Was I wrong for wanting to be a part of this important day for my family? Or had I been setting myself up for unrealistic expectations from people who never saw me as an important part of their lives? My silence throughout this period wasn't acceptance. It was just holding back the pain, trying not to burden anyone further. But each day that passed, I felt more invisible than ever. Instead of being acknowledged, I was criticized for not being more positive or not showing enough interest. It felt like no matter what I did, even trying to be present, it was all in vain. As my parents prepared for the trip, things only got worse. They never mentioned any details about the wedding or the trip to me. One morning, my mother casually asked if I had packed, but I couldn't hide the shock and anger I felt. I had never been told about the trip, never asked about a flight ticket, a room, or anything related to the event. They had made all the arrangements for my siblings, while I was left out like an afterthought in my own family. When I asked if I even had a ticket, my mother casually said they'd buy me a cheap last-minute one if I wanted to go. But I could only feel my anger and hurt rise. At that moment, I knew for sure that I wasn't a part of this wedding. The feeling of being forgotten, of being left out of every plan and preparation, had been building up inside me, and it finally exploded. I couldn't stay silent anymore. But instead of just keeping my frustration to myself, I decided to take action, knowing it would disrupt everything. All the emotions I had been bottling up for so long finally found their release, and I couldn't bear the thought of my whole family heading off to a beautiful place without me, while I remained the outsider in my own home. When my family left, I stayed behind in the empty room, a lump rising in my throat. All the feelings of being forgotten, being left out, came rushing back. But this time I couldn't stay silent anymore. I couldn't just watch them happy and carefree while I was still being left behind. Anger flared up inside me, and I felt like I had to do something to release it. I didn't understand why I made the decision I did, but I felt that if I didn't speak up, I would never have the chance to say what I had been holding in. Everything felt like a storm inside me. All the years of feeling like a shadow, all the times I was excluded, had built up into a moment I couldn't let pass by. I had to do something to make it known, so I decided to make the truth public on social media. I took a photo of myself holding a negative COVID test and captioned it, "Not sick at all, just forgotten." I tagged everyone who had asked about my absence and everyone who had been invited to the wedding. I knew it was a risky move, but I felt it was the only way to express my pain and disappointment. It wasn't just about not being part of the wedding, it was about being forgotten and left out within my own family. Almost immediately after I posted it, reactions started flooding in. Some people sent words of encouragement, supporting me for speaking up and showing my true feelings. They couldn't believe my parents could treat me this way, and they felt sympathy for me. But there were also plenty of people who seemed shocked and skeptical of my story, thinking there must be something more to it than I was saying. I didn't expect everyone to sympathize with me, but all I wanted was for the truth to be heard, for people to understand how long I had been suffering in silence in this family. Soon after, I received a barrage of messages from my family, especially from my parents. The insults and accusations were relentless. They called me selfish, immature, and said I was just trying to create drama to get attention. But for me, none of that mattered. I couldn't stand the thought of continuing to endure years of being forgotten without ever having a chance to explain myself. It felt like everything in me exploded, and although I wasn't sure if I was doing the right thing, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't keep living in the shadow of those who had forgotten me for so long. And when my parents returned from the trip, they didn't just scold me. They made me feel guilty for ruining the happiness of their wedding. Though I didn't feel entirely proud of my actions, I didn't regret it. I spoke up, and that was something I could no longer keep silent about. After I posted, my life was completely turned upside down. I didn't expect my actions to stir up such a huge storm in my family. My parents were furious, and their criticisms hit me like waves crashing against me. Not only did they call me selfish, but they also accused me of doing everything just to seek attention and ruin their special day. I felt incredibly confused, because while they had their reasons, the pain I had been enduring couldn't just be ignored. Every argument with my parents made me feel more and more like I was losing my place in the family. They didn't understand me. They didn't see what I had been through. When I tried to explain, talking about the feeling of being forgotten all this time, they just brushed it off as me justifying my actions. The hurtful words felt like stones thrown in my face, and I didn't know how to prove that I wasn't wrong. My sister and brother didn't understand either. My sister sent me a message accusing me of always trying to create drama, always wanting to show off my personal issues in public. I felt so sad, because I never imagined my own family would think of me like that. Everyone saw me as an outsider, a troublemaker in the family, while I just wanted to be heard and understood. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in the house grew increasingly tense. My mother remained silent, but the disappointment in her eyes was palpable. My father was angry, constantly reminding me of my mistake, as if I had done something unforgivable. I felt like I was trapped in a cage, unable to escape from the anger and disappointment of everyone around me. I didn't know what to do, and the more I thought about it, the more I felt like I might have done everything wrong. But a part of me also felt relieved because at least I had spoken up. I couldn't keep living in silence when I felt unloved and unimportant. I might have been wrong in choosing this way to handle things, but I couldn't regret speaking out instead of letting everything pass without saying a word. The following days became unbearable. The feeling of loneliness and being left out only grew stronger. I wanted to hear an apology, some kind of explanation, but nothing changed. Even though I had tried to express my feelings, I still felt like I was left alone in that room, with a pain I couldn't share. My parents' words, my siblings' reactions, all of it made me feel more isolated and hopeless than ever.